I'm Bill Auten of Auten Claims Management.
I'm Chantal Roberts of CMR Consulting, and welcome to the Art of Adjusting podcast.
Today, we're going to talk about life as an insurance adjuster from the perspective of property, auto, liability, or workers' compensation adjusters. Our goal is to bring interesting topics in the world of claims adjusting to people who are working as an adjuster now and to people who are considering a career as a claims adjuster. All right. Hi, Chantal. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I heard today we're going to talk about some wet stuff.
Yeah, water.
Water. All right.
Yeah. So hopefully we've all taken showers and baths and everything. And yeah.
So today, let's see, we're going to talk about this whole conversation was inspired by an article that discussed storm surge.
Yes.
And the reason that that's important is that it kind of defined storm surge, which isn't really defined in the policy. And in most policies, it's not really even mentioned. I think up until 2011, they added storm surge as part of the water damage description or definition. So, as always in this business, the devil is in the details. And in this case, we're wondering what constitutes water damage. And, if you're an adjuster or even a homeowner, how do you know whether you've got water damage that would be covered under the policy? And there's all kinds of different water damage, isn't there?
Yeah, there really is. And so, like you said, the devil is in the details. So let's start off with some definitions. The article that we've mentioned is by Karen Sorrell. It was November 9th, 2020. So a little old, but I mean, not by much. It's with Property Casualty 360. I do encourage everybody, if you are not taking their newsletters, do. They have some great ways to learn because they have very short articles that you can keep or you can read or whatever. However, like I said, devil's in the details, or like you said, devil's in the details. We need to talk about definitions. And so Ms. Sorrell did a great job defining what storm surge is. She states that according to NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the definition of storm surge is the abnormal rise in seawater level during a storm, measured as the height of the water above a normal predicted astronomical tide. She goes on to say the surge is caused primarily by the storm's winds pushing water onshore. So we're used to seeing a lot of storm surges when we see hurricanes. Yeah, that's where we usually see that. Now, of course, this is going to be different than flooding, which has a completely different definition.
So you say it's different. Is it different because it's a different kind of water intrusion, or is it different because it is covered or it is not covered?
Flood, of course, would not be covered under your normal policies.
Homeowners policy or business
Yeah, or
policy?
business policies or whatever. I was going to say ISO policies, but I don't think the AAIS covers them either. You would have to, of course, have flood coverage. And I do believe if you are going to be adjusting flood claims, you have to be flood certified, a flood certified adjuster, going
That is
through the
correct.
NFIP, which is the National Flood Insurance Program. So
Yep.
yeah, is that right? National Flood Insurance Program.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yay. Yay
And
me.
the policies, those flood policies are far different than your average homeowner's policy in terms of what they cover. The limits are different. I believe the application of a deductible may be different. I'm not positive about that. Do they have hurricane deductibles on a flood policy, or is that just on a?
I think they don't cover hurricanes at all,
Okay.
period. Because when I have seen, and what I thought we could talk about too is, little selfless plug here is my book will be coming out on May 11th. And I do actually talk about flooding, water backup and blah, blah, blah. But I also talk about, and of course, this book is for the consumers. But I have the same information in the Art of Adjusting book, how an adjuster, like a homeowner adjuster and like the flood adjuster, should be working together.
Right.
And
Right. Because some of the damages might be covered under one policy and other damages might be covered under the other one. And they got to work that out.
Yes. And it's not up to the consumer really to do that, even though the consumer is supposed to be proving their claim. The consumer doesn't know how to do that. You know,
Right.
that's why I'm so impassioned about teaching adjusters how to do this and do their job, you know, because we can make it so much better. Anyway, let me tell you about the flood definition. And so we can compare it then to what a storm surge is. And according to the government, the National Flood Insurance Program, a flood is defined as a general and temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land area, or of 2 or more properties, at least one of which is your property, meaning the insured's property, from overflow of inland or tidal waters, or unusual and rapid accumulation or runoff of surface waters from any source. Now, that
That's
of course,
broader.
that is a lot broader. It does, and I know people who are listening would go, okay, well, I heard tidal waters, and then storm surge also kind of mentioned tide, and you know, inundation. Well, that's what a storm surge is. They are somewhat different. And I know a lot of adjusters get boogered up. I used to, honestly, I'll be honest with you, full transparency. I used to get buggered up with the whole flood thing when we had heavy rain and the sewers couldn't take the rainwater that was coming through, which is happening more and more,
Mhm.
you know. Like Detroit had it a couple of years ago. So the sewer water or the sewers just can't handle all of that, and so water will then start backing up. Well, backup isn't covered under a policy, under your unendorsed standard homeowners policy. You know, I don't even think it's covered under commercial. But so what would be covered? You know, I think we just need to talk about those sorts of things.
Sure. So the one question that comes up in the circles that I play in occasionally is the fact that storm surge is caused by wind, and
Mhm.
wind is covered under your policy. So why isn't storm surge, water damage from storm surge, covered if it's caused by high winds?
Well, you've got the very nice concurrent causation or anti-concurrent causation language in a policy.
Mhm.
And the best way that I have always explained it is when we're talking to the insureds is like this anti-concurrent causation. What it means is that if there's two causes of loss and one's covered and one is not, like wind is covered and storm surge is not covered, then the loss, the damage would not be covered because of the anti-concurrent causation. Now, a lot of states don't support this. So, you know, you need to be looking into your state. If you have a question, contact coverage counsel or whatever. However, if you are working in a state that does support anti-concurrent causation, you could deny that claim when there's storm surge caused by wind, uh, because of that language, which basically says one's covered, one's not. We're just going to say the whole thing is off. We're not going to provide coverage. And the way that I've always explained it to insureds is it's kind of like timesing something by zero. You always get zero. It doesn't matter what number you have, you're always going to get zero. 1 times 0, 0. 10 times 0, 0. You
Mhm.
know, so that's kind of the way that I understand it or have explained it.
Yep. Another approach is to just look at the water damage definition under the HO3. This is a 2000 version. Water damage means flood, surface water, waves, tidal water, overflow of a body of water, or spray from any of these, whether or not driven by wind.
hmm hmm Yeah, and that's really important. And then of course you get into when we're talking about water, surface water is something that is mentioned. And of course, surface water is not defined. So what happens when we don't have a definition, much like the was surge was not defined or is not defined. Flood isn't even defined really
No,
in the policy. And
no,
I
they rely on water damage
mm,
as the blanket
yeah.
term. Um,
And I think, I had written an article, and I don't know when it's going to come out, but I've written an article, and I was talking about how water, just looking at the homeowners policy is what I was looking at in this article. Just looking at your homeowners policy, water is mostly defined by what it is not than what it is. Because I mean, technically, the word quote water end quote is not defined either.
right.
It's more defined as it's not surface water, it's not flood, it's not backup, it's not overflow, it's not this, it's not that.
An
That's
accidental discharge.
yeah, yeah. And so it's kind of like, well, what is covered? It's that is that question that the insureds always ask is, well, what am I paying premiums for? Well,
The
it
policy is
depends.
not very friendly when it comes to these definitions. The policy is set up in the way it is in order to protect the insurance company from paying claims that they, from an underwriting standpoint, really can't afford to pay on a
Mhm.
large scale.
Yes. Such
And
as flood,
right,
which would,
so it would bankrupt most of the carriers in the U.S. right now. And because that is considered an uninsurable risk, that's why you have the federal program
yes.
to protect people for that. And that is also why you'll never see ads on television for flood policies like you do for homeowners policies,
Right.
promising that they'll pay, extra bells and whistles. You just don't see that kind of thing in the flood program because it's kind of like, I don't want to say welfare, but it's kind of like a subsidized government cheese for
Yeah.
insurance.
Yes. And it is very pared down. So you had mentioned, like what does the flood program would they have a hurricane deductible? And no. So basically the way that these programs work is for the flood program, what the policy says is like, yeah, we will pay for basically your house. I think you have to pay extra if you want contents to be covered. And don't quote me on that though, but I
I
know
think
it'll
you're
pay.
right. Yeah.
I thought I had read that, and it'll pay for your house. And then, uh, guys, the thing is, though, is like Florida, for example. Hi, Brandon. We should,
Hey,
he if he had flood coverage, it only goes up to, I think the max policy is something like 650,000. Or they were wanting to get it up to 650,000 because it is not a lot. And a lot of homes in Florida, for example, are more than that. So I don't know because I've never handled flood. I'm not flood certified or anything like that, but I would wonder if there is some kind of co-insurance requirement involved in that. I would think that there would have to be, but I read articles about the issues that flood coverage is doesn't have high enough limits. And so what are people in flood prone areas or places that have storm surge such as Louisiana, Florida,
Houston.
Houston, all the Gulf Coast, all the eastern, sideboard and all of that, what are they going to do when they have homes out there that cost more than 650,000? Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that the dynamics of it, it's kind of, think about it as the economy of flood. This is the way I look at it anyway. Having handled claims in areas that routinely get flooded, those houses primarily are built on slabs. They are constructed in a way that when the floodwaters come in most areas, you're not talking about, well, there's some areas that certainly it's 8 or 10 feet deep. But for most residential neighborhoods, it's deep enough to do some damage to the flooring and drywall and pretty much everything below 4 or maybe 6 feet
Right.
of the house. And I've been in these places that have had 3, 4, 5 different flood claims on their policy. And in every one, they do a flood cut of the drywall and they get rid of the flooring and they replace all of the furniture that was on that floor. And if it's in a place like Houston, it dries out pretty quick once the floodwaters recede. And so they get the place dried out and they put the place back together and it's ready for the next flood. So we're not talking about total losses to homes. We're not talking about, cheap claims either. We're not talking about, claims that are insignificant by any means. Um, but in some of these areas, they are kind of prepared, not really prepared as much as resilient
Mhm.
to flood damage, more so than in other areas. Like up here in the north, everybody has basements. We don't have a whole lot of flood here. The primary cause of water damage here when we have a lot of rain is usually failed sump pumps and that kind of thing. If we had floodwaters like they do in Houston here, it would be devastating. I mean, it would be a
Yeah,
huge, huge loss.
because it would all run into your basement first
It
and
would fill
fill
the
up
basement
base
first. Yeah.
base
Yeah.
fill the basement first and then go up to 3 feet. So your whole basement is gone. So you're absolutely right. And I want to talk about sump pump and back, those kind of things, failures and that kind of stuff too. But yeah, you're right. I mean, everyone is encouraged to get flood insurance if you
Mm.
live on the coast or whatever. And sometimes the insured's mortgage holder will make them get that. But
Yeah. Yeah. That well, they'll be required to if they live in a flood zone.
yeah,
And I certainly don't mean to minimize the damage that flood can do in some of those very flood prone areas. But my point in bringing that up is that you're not always talking about policy limits cases on those flood policies. You're talking about damage to everything basically on the first floor. Um, and like I said, there are places that I've been in that have been completely destroyed from top to bottom because of flood. So
yeah,
don't get me wrong. I know
yeah,
water can do a lot of damage,
right. So
but
if I thought, since we were talking about flood right now, I would show the adjusters something that they may want to look up, and we'll put the link in the show notes and everything if that's cool with you.
sure.
So this is actually the FEMA website where you can go look to see if the insured's address is in a flood zone. So if they're saying, oh, it's flooded, and you think that it's really a burst pipe or something, well, of course, we know the definition is if you're in a city, two or more properties, one of which is yours. So you're going to go next door or have your independent estimator go next door and say, did you flood as well? Do you have water damage, so that you can isolate it that way as well. But you can go in here, and we'll put this link in the show notes. But you can go into this FEMA flood map and type in your address to find out if you or that particular area is in a flood zone. And you can also type in your address to see if you live in a flood zone. So here is a what the map looks like. And for those of you who are just listening and not watching on Spotify, well, tough toenails. Sorry, guys. So what this looks like is it is a map. You can pull up what particular area you want. This bold green or lime green area is what the map number is. And the last time that they took a survey of that area, in this particular area, I'm in the city of Olathe, and I'm looking at it, and we've got 2009 is the last time that they did something. So you see like a whole bunch of like multiple colors here. There's like this blue thing, and if you see here, that you'll see that this is an effective area. You can see this red and green area, and they'll have that, which is a regulated flood zone area. They will even have like zone AE, and you can go somewhere and figure out what zone AE is. I have known what those are, but I do not remember what they are now. But anyway, you could go in here and find out like, oh yeah, if my insured is living in one particular area, they are in a spot that actually floods quite a bit. And if you are watching on YouTube, you can see here that what Olathe has done is they have tried to keep people out of this flood zone. There happens to be a creek that runs through there that gets flooded. So they've tried to keep, building away from this area. So anyway, I thought I would share that with people because I find it very fascinating, first of all, but then two, you kind of need to know that as an adjuster.
And just to clarify that map, if you have a property, if you're an adjuster and you're dealing with a property that falls into that flood zone, it doesn't mean anything from a coverage standpoint. Whether it's in the flood zone or out of the flood zone does not change the circumstances of the policy.
No.
All it means is that that property owner qualifies to obtain a flood insurance policy. And if they have a mortgage, they're likely required to have a flood insurance policy.
Right. Absolutely. So, would you like to talk about, before we move on, how to maybe cooperate with the flood adjuster if there is a flood? Or
Sure. So in my experience, when I've met with flood adjusters, we start off by comparing war stories and checking out each other's cameras
yeah, yeah,
and what kind of gear we use and all that kind
yeah,
of stuff. And then we go into a diatribe of who do we know in the business,
yes,
and
yes,
then but then it gets down to brass tacks, and we start talking about the water lines, and what if there was a hurricane that came through, there will be wind damage, and then there'll be water damage from flood.
right,
And the water damage from flood is usually designated by the line of smudge that is left when the flood waters recede. So everything below that line was definitely flood damaged. Everything above if it's damaged, it had to have been wind.
hmm,
So as the adjuster on the main policy, without flood coverage on your policy, you can't cover anything below the flood line
right,
unless there's some sort of evidence that it was damaged before the flood got there by wind. And
right, and
sometimes you might have some video evidence of that, but that's the most significant, kind of interaction that you have with the flood adjuster is determining where that line is, how high it went in the building, and
mhm.
sorting that out.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that it is possible that, for example, when there's a hurricane, because of the strong winds, it's completely possible that the wind has knocked out, let's say, the second story window, maybe ripped off the roof or something like that, and you still have a lot of rain going on because they're picking
Hmm.
up that water and going. So it's still possible that the whole second floor is wet, and maybe even the first floor's ceiling or walls are wet because of the rain coming through and seeping through the different floors. And so just because there is water on the first floor, um, and there's a flood line or whatever, you may still cover, as the wind or the normal or the standard or whatever you want to call it policy, you may still cover everything up even though it's water. I mean, like, obviously the flood adjuster wouldn't cover the ceiling because that's water falling from the sky. That would be something that you would cover.
Hmm.
Then what I have always told my adjusters is when they're calling the insured, making first contact, explaining coverages, explaining what the steps in the claim is or are, find out, do you have flood coverage? Yes or no. Okay, great. Have you talked to your flood adjuster? Yes or no. What is that flood adjuster's name? Uh, you know, policy number or claim number, phone number, and then you try to, if you can't get someone out there at the same time, let's say I would hire you, Bill, to go out and write everything, even the flood damage, but write me a separate estimate for the flood damage because I'm not going to pay for that.
Right.
Right. And then I'm going to just pay for the storm damage. Or it could be that everything gets written by the insurance contractor. And then I've got to do like a, I don't know, 60-40 split or an 80-20 split or whatever that you would agree with the flood adjuster with.
Yeah, and it's certainly not an arbitrary number
No,
or percentage. It will wind up being a percentage at the end of the day, but you've got to sort out what was damaged by the flood versus what was damaged by a covered peril.
yes,
And we had a vigorous discussion about timing of losses when we had our policy term
we did.
discussion, but something applies here too in time in terms of timing. And if you have a very bad windstorm followed by a very bad rain or flood event, like you said, the roof could be taken off and everything in the house could have been damaged by rainwater.
Exactly.
And then the flood comes through.
Yeah.
um, and the adjuster says, well, that flood stuff isn't covered. And the insured is like, yeah, but the flood didn't come through the next day. And in the meantime, all my stuff was damaged by rain.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, those kinds of things are probably rare, but if you talk to people that handle only that kind of stuff, it probably isn't too rare.
Yeah, to be honest with you, let's talk Katrina and Rita. Those two, they were a month apart, and the damage was so severe to the area of New Orleans that we and our adjusters were not able to get into like the Ninth Ward
Right.
before the levees broke. And so we then didn't know, well, which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Right.
And in those instances, you just make a judgment call. You work it out with the flood adjuster. Now, I do want to mention something that's very interesting, and I don't know if they still adhere to it. I'd love to hear from like someone who handles Louisiana now. But when Katrina and Rita happened, there were so many insurance companies not paying the full amount and leaving the insureds high and dry that they were saying, no, you can't use the flood line as the example of what you will and will not pay as an,
Who,
as
who,
the
who,
Louisiana Department of Insurance.
okay.
Yeah, they,
Well, it was tough because you had situations where when the adjuster did get to the property, it was just a slab.
yes,
It was nothing left.
exactly.
So there's no physical evidence. And the only evidence that you have is the obvious wind that took place
Hmm.
and the obvious storm surge. It
Yes.
happened by one of the two. And,
Who
you
knows which
know,
one? Yeah. But
you're,
anyway,
yeah,
I think our advice to everyone is always work it out. Don't be that bad apple that gets taken to court and makes it bad for the rest of us, you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
Um, yeah.
It's funny. I remember on social media once I had mentioned that adjusters don't like drafting disclaimer letters, not because it hurts our heart necessarily, feels bad, when you have to deny coverage for sure,
Mm.
but it's a pain. It's like a lot easier to just write a check
Yeah.
because when you write a disclaimer, you've got to like basically restudy the whole policy and go through every point and find out which exclusions and which provisions you need to include in your letter. And then that letter is 7 or 8 pages long. It is not fun. A
Mm-mm.
check, that's just some numbers.
Yeah.
And you might have to get some prior approval, but guess what? You got to do that with a disclaimer letter anyway. You're not
Yeah.
going to just be firing those off on your own. That
Right.
should always have another set of eyes on them. Even if it's not your superior, if you're in a situation where you're instructed to draft a bunch of disclaimer letters, get somebody else's eyeballs on it just to make sure that they're
Hmm.
proper. Anyway, my point is my theory still stands. It's easier to write checks than it is disclaimer letters.
It is. It totally is.
And one of the responses I got said, I used to hear this argument when I was a kid. This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. And I'm like, no, 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 no. It's not like that.
It's not like that, but it is, it's more time consuming. We get yelled at more. So, if we're having to deny a claim, we get yelled at more. So it's a lot easier just to pay the claim.
Mhm.
Moving on, one of the things that I thought that I would mention, because I feel it's important, because I think the bad apples in the adjusting world will use excuses to deny claims. And I'm not saying that there aren't those people who do it. For example, we're talking about sump pump failures in basements. Uh, my husband and I had a sump pump failure, and it was very hard for me not to say my basement was flooded. Because if you think about it, that is the vernacular.
Yeah,
That is
but
that is that is what
flood
we
is
say.
flood is not defined. I understand what you're saying,
Right.
because flood typically isn't covered.
But
Um,
but see, that's my point, is as a policy holder, I might say my basement is flooded, and you as an adjuster will go, oh, flood's not covered. I'm going to send out a letter of declination and close the file.
right.
So don't, well, I guess my point of advice is, don't necessarily listen to exactly the words that the insured is using, because they don't necessarily speak our same language.
Right.
What they may say is, my sump pump overflowed, or my sump pump stopped working, and then we had a backup, which again would not be covered, but
Well,
um,
there's so many, many
unless you
years
have that
ago,
endorsement.
I had just, well, you can get the sump pump backup endorsement
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
to remedy that. Um, but without that, one of the arguments that I've heard, and this is from a major insurance carrier, one of their adjusters and I were talking about when a sump pump fails and whether or not the damage in the water in the basement should be covered. And it's always been no. I mean, the answer in my career has always been no.
Right.
He said, well, no, no, no. It's an overflow, like when you pour too much coffee in a coffee cup.
Hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, but there's drains attached to it, and it's those things that are overflowing. So, um, and the more you talk about it, the more it becomes a gray area.
Yes,
And you know what happens with those.
exactly. So what happens with
So
those, Bill? So for those of us who are just now listening and tuning in,
this is what we call an ambiguity.
yes. And what is
And
an ambiguity?
well, that means something that it doesn't have a clear answer. And when it's in the context of a contract, and that contract was drafted by one party and given to the other party on a take it or leave it basis, we call that a contract of adhesion.
Or an
And in
insurance
those,
policy?
or an insurance policy. And in those cases, when there's an ambiguity, those ambiguities are often decided in favor of the party that did not draft the contract. In this case, that'd be the policyholder.
Like, absolutely. Yeah.
So anyway, in response to this ambiguity, and by the way, most of the carriers I work with will not be paying this, whether or not they have this fix that I'm going to tell you about in a second or not. Their argument, there's two arguments against it. One is the policyholder had an opportunity to purchase some pump coverage and they didn't, and that would have covered this. So therefore, that was designed to overtake this policy. That's why there's no coverage. That's the one argument. The other argument is that a failure of a sump pump is actually a maintenance issue. That if you fail to maintain it and that results in damage, that's not covered. That's failure to maintain the property. That's another argument I've heard to overcome this ambiguity. Now,
Mhm.
in response to the ambiguity, though, the industry has changed the water damage exclusion they've updated it to include language that refers specifically to sump pumps that stop working.
Mhm.
and says that if that is the cause of the water damage in the basement, this is not an overflow claim. This is now a water damage claim that is not covered under the policy.
Yeah. And it took me a while to learn the difference between quote backup and quote overflow, because again, these are not terms that are defined in the policy.
Right.
And a backup is when like your water will uh that comes from an outside source, originates from an outside source, comes back up the water or the plumbing system and flows backwards into the property. I have even heard the term backup being where water trespasses, quote unquote, onto your property.
Okay.
Whereas an overflow will be where a blockage or a clog is. And like, so there's like a bottom, so to speak, and the water can't escape. So then it overflows the plumbing system onto the property.
Right.
So in the sense of a coffee cup, then yes, that is an overflow because you have a bottom.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed, and your toilet, if you have two stepsons who eat quite a bit and they're boys and they don't necessarily clean their, flushed things and they just continue to flush, you have an overflow. Not that I'm speaking from any type of experience whatsoever.
I don't know. Sounds like a very specific
Yeah, a
example.
very
Thank you for
specific
that.
example that went all the way from the second floor to the first floor into the kitchen. Oh, yay. Anyway,
So, as to overflow and the exclusion relating to water damage, one of the confounding issues that relates to backup is that it's usually termed backup of a sewer or a drain. And this is a dichotomy here because the carrier will argue that the sump pump is a drain, and and if that backs up, there's no coverage; it's excluded. On the overflow, it's backup of a plumbing system. So the argument is, well, those pipes underneath there, that's all plumbing, and shouldn't that be covered if it's an overflow? Because drains are part of a plumbing system, aren't they? And the carrier says, no, that's not plumbing at all. Anyway, there's some gray areas there that
there
you could
are,
that are problematic. So the
but
best
it,
way to do it is to have that sump pump language in your water damage definition or your plumbing system definition to eliminate that ambiguity.
yes. And also, again, even if it's not a sump pump that we're talking about, for example, I just happen to use it because I know that that's a very good example for me. It was very hard for me not to say when I was talking to the adjuster, yes, my basement has flooded.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's my sump pump has stopped working and I have sump pump, you know, backup overflow endorsement.
Yeah,
So just to make sure that I'm not using that word.
you're right.
So
And the word flood is definitely under the water damage
yeah,
definition,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so
but it
let's
doesn't define flood, which
no, 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 it doesn't. And that's why I wanted to, again, as I always say, it's very important to start off, or as you say, to start off with our brass tacks to know what our definitions are. What storm surge definition is, what flood definition is, what our backup and overflow definitions are. And I would pay attention, finally, I guess our final parting words on this is pay attention to our exceptions to the exclusions when it's talking about overflows. Because in some instances, for example, with our HVAC system or something like that, if it has an overflow of water, then that might be covered based off of the exception to the exclusion.
Or an endorsement that's tacked onto the back of the policy. That's
Yes.
a completely separate form.
Yes.
And then if they have that, then you also have to, hey, look at that.
I know.
We
Simon is
have a
here.
visitor.
Simon is here. If anybody knows coverage, it is going to be Simon.
Simon, good.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Um, I was going to say, even if they have that endorsement and you catch it, you may also want to make sure that there's no added water damage coverage. A lot of carriers will have normally it's like a $2,500 or $5,000 limit as
mhm,
like a standard, but you
yeah.
can buy more. Like
Yeah.
if you want $15,000, you can pay extra for it.
Right.
And that would be another endorsement tacked on, or it'd be a fill-in endorsement of some sort where they write in the amount of coverage that's on there. Anyway,
Right.
you got to read the policy in all the forms.
In all the forms, all of it, every single time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it can change. Like my sump pump uh, endorsement was, I think, $10,000.
Hmm.
So I mean, it doesn't go up to the full policy limit of what my home is.
No,
Thing.
no, no.
But it
And
was,
they're not, I mean, I wouldn't say they're a cheap endorsement to get, but they're, I would say, affordable. I mean, if
yeah,
you have a decent sized house, you're going to probably want that on there.
especially if you have a big size basement. Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah.
especially if it's in a finished basement.
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And
Yep.
one word of advice, if you are going to finish your basement, always imagine the scenario that it's going to fill with water one of these days. So be
Hmm.
careful about what you decide to put down there.
Hmm.
If you've got a baby grand piano that's worth $15,000 and you have the choice of putting that upstairs in the living room or downstairs in the basement, I don't think I need to tell you which way to go here. There are
Uh,
certain things that decisions you can make that will make your life easier when your sump pump fails.
is this from personal experience as well?
I've been a claims adjuster since 30 years ago. So
Yeah.
yeah, I would say so. Yes. Not
Okay.
personal, like our piano's upstairs. But yeah,
So, well, and the fun thing is, I like to use this example as well. When our sump pump failed, my husband and I, we first were standing on the stair before you hit the basement floor, looking at it, going, "Oh my gosh, what do we do?" And it was about 2 inches of water, and it took us a good 5-10 seconds before our training kicked in, and we knew we needed to get everything up off of the floor,
right,
and then start pulling things that we couldn't lift up on bricks or whatever off of the floor, uh get it moved out of the basement. So imagine if it took two adjusters, because my husband is adjuster. So imagine if it took two adjusters a good 10 seconds to overcome our shock and figure out what to do,
right,
what it would take an insured who doesn't have that training because they have never worked these claims.
right,
So again, I guess my final parting advice to people is take a breath and remember these people don't do this every day. These
right,
people being your insureds.
right,
So you do need to walk them through it. Yes, you do need to pick up all of your albums, for example. We carried out all of my husband's records uh, because we were afraid it might get damp and there might be too much moisture, which would warp things.
right.
And so we carried every single one of all of his albums, and he's a record collector, thousands upstairs.
There's some dynamics to that kind of damage that people should be aware of. One is that your basement floor, in all likelihood, has a slight pitch to it that leads to a sump pump pit if you have a sump pump pit or a drain. And because of that, as it fills up, it doesn't fill up like fast. Imagine, think about how long it takes to fill up a bathtub. Now multiply that times the size of your basement, and the water flow is much lower than your faucet in most cases. When that happens, you're going to see, you'll just see some water pooling around the sump pump at first, and then it'll gradually start to encroach into other areas of the basement. Meaning that if you catch it early enough, you've got a lot of time to move stuff and get it out of the way. Not only that, but you might also have time to get somebody there that can swap the sump pump out and put a new one in, or put a temporary pump in somehow that'll extract that water for you. And then another thing that you should be aware about are the sensors that you can buy that sit right on the floor. And if they get wet, you get a notification on your cell phone. And that gives you advance warning that the water has overflowed the sump pump. And now you know you've got maybe a half an hour before it gets into the other area, and you got to get down there and start moving stuff around.
Yeah, or you
That,
could just be like Chantal and be worried about basements. They still creep me out, so I don't really go down there. But we not only have a sump pump, but we've got a backup sump pump, and then we've got a battery in case the electricity gets cut to
right.
run the two sump pumps, and then we got a battery for the battery
Mm-hmm. Yep.
because I, I don't want to deal with that again.
We have a couple properties, and the main property that we live in doesn't have a sump pump. It actually has a well in the basement. It's an old house with a stone
Wow.
well. Yeah, it's really cool. So that never floods. If it, get too much water, the level of the well just rises a little.
And it's
But
never overflowed?
no, no. And
Neat.
we're kind of on a hill.
Oh,
So
okay, okay, okay.
the water table just kind of stays the same. Now the
Mm,
other house, um, that has a crawl space that's very hard to get to the sump pump unless you crawl through there. So we have a camera,
mm,
and I check it every day.
mm-hmm.
And about 3, 4 months ago, the sump pump went, um, and I caught it before the alarms even went off. I just glanced at it and I saw the water level was higher than it should be. Now there's a backup pump higher, so that pump was working.
Mm-hmm.
So we had plenty of time to get down there and swap it out and save the day.
Yeah,
But
but
so those are tricks that you can do to minimize the impact. Instead of,
for
if
yourself.
if you don't
Um,
want to buy that insurance policy for the sump pump backup, you can do this kind of stuff instead, and manage that risk yourself, or you can double up on it and get the insurance and take care of all this stuff too.
right.
It's all the level of grief that you're willing to put yourself through, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, we still have that particular endorsement. We haven't raised the limit because I don't feel like I need to raise the limit now that I have two sump pumps and two batteries.
Mhm.
You know, but imagine how long that thing had been backing up if there was 2 inches of water. I mean, our
Right.
basement's not huge, but you know, anyway,
Well, the other thing that happens is when a sump pump stops working, not only does the sump crock, the hole that it sits in, not only does that have to fill up before you can tell, unless you're looking down in it. And a
right.
lot of them have covers on them. Most of them have, I think they're by code need to have a cover on it. Um, but not only does it have to fill that crock up, but there are pipes attached to that basin,
Hmm.
and those pipes go around the whole perimeter of the basement,
Hmm.
and they all have to fill up too. So you actually have a lot of time between the time that the sump pump stops working and there's a foot of water in your basement.
Yeah.
So the trick is to monitor the actual pump to make sure that's working. That's why the camera works so good, because
Yeah, that's a great
every
idea.
time the float goes up and down, it triggers a recording.
Hmm.
So all I have to do is look at the recordings, and there's a time between each one, and I'll know if it's running every 15 minutes or every half hour or sometimes every minute, depending on the rain.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
I'm a nerd that way.
Well, I mean, it is important for all of our adjusters to listen to, so, but also it's important for all of our adjusters to go through these kinds of things so you can have empathy for your insureds.
Yeah, yeah.
is
Yeah, and
exactly
this
what we're
advice
talking
really,
about.
this
Yeah.
advice is more for a homeowner than an adjuster.
Well, yeah.
I mean, you're not going to go to, as an adjuster, you're not going to go to a homeowner and say, you didn't have a camera?
Oh
What's the
my
matter with
God,
you?
what's wrong with you? That would be bad. That would not be empathetic, as
No, it would
and
not.
we have had episodes on empathy and listening to our insureds and all of that. We could probably figure out what number that is. I don't know right off the top of my head, but anyway.
I don't know. It's
Um,
always worth redoing if we need to.
yeah, probably. Speaking of episodes, I don't even know what we're doing in 2 weeks.
Let's see if I can find it before you do.
Oh, okay. Do 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 do
I got the
do.
spreadsheet here.
Okay, I do too. ACV and indemnity is what we've got.
Oh boy. Are we going to have another
Yay.
depreciation debate?
Oh God, yes, we are. Yes, it's going to be so much fun. And it will be on Thursday, April the 11th is when the podcast will be coming out. This podcast, of course, will be coming out on March 28th. But yeah, should be fun because you
I
and I have
have
had
a,
this discussion before.
yeah. I have a blog post on depreciation and third party liability property damage claims. And so that can probably generate some conversation, I would think.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we can get all of that in. Anything
Cool.
else to for us to talk about, Bill?
No, other than just if you're an insurance company or a self-insured entity and you need some help with third-party liability claims, go to www.auten.claims and check out all the stuff we do there. And then if you're looking for some work as a liability adjuster, you can find out more on how to work for us there too.
Yep. Yep. I will go ahead and plug the book, Once Upon a Claim, Fairy Tales to Protect Your Assets. This will be good for insurance companies to buy and give to their insureds. So
Yeah,
they will know because I honestly believe that if the insureds knew what we as adjusters knew, it would, make our claims go by faster. Claims could be settled quicker, which would mean less loss adjustment expense, less litigation, all of that kind of fun stuff. So you're saving money, companies. Why
yeah.
wouldn't you buy this and give it to people? Anyway,
Is that available now?
May 11th. It'll
May
be
11th.
out on May 11th. And you can contact me at CMR or cmroberts at cmrconsulting.net. Talk to me about bulk buys.
Of buying thousands of them at a time.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. Okay, so we'll see you later.
Yes.
Okay,
All right. Have a
awesome.
great day.
Thanks.
Bye
Bye.
bye. Thanks for joining us on the Art of Adjusting podcast, where we talk about life as an insurance adjuster.
If you enjoyed this podcast or this episode, please give us 5 stars and a review. It does help the algorithm pick us up.
Hit that subscribe button real quick and tell all of your adjuster friends to check this out as well. For independent adjusting services, go to www.auten.claims. And for anyone interested in working as an independent liability adjuster, go to the Contact Us tab to join our roster.
In the meantime, you can contact me at theartofadjusting.com for consulting and training purposes.